The gun was already in her hand when Walter Bishop kicked open the door. He had not expected that. In 15 years of running the Broken Spur Ranch, 15 years of making hard choices in hard country, 15 years of carrying a rule so ironclad it had become the architecture of his whole soul, he had not expected the woman sitting at his desk to have a Colt single-action army aimed directly at the space between his eyes before the door had even finished swinging on its hinges. He froze. She did not. "Whoever you are," she said, her voice carrying the particular calm of someone who had been calm in worse moments than this one. "You have about 3 seconds to explain yourself before I decide you are one of Harlan Doyle's men and act accordingly." Walter Bishop was 6 feet 2 inches of solid ranching muscle, a man who had stared down rustlers and flash floods and a drought that had lasted 3 punishing years. He had buried a wife. He had buried a foreman. He had buried his one rule about women and hired hands and entanglements of the heart so deep in the bedrock of his life that he had stopped thinking of it as a choice and started thinking of it as simply who he was. And right now, standing in the doorway of his own office with a woman he had never seen before in his life holding steady iron on him, he felt something shift in his chest that he could not name. "This is my ranch," he said. "That," she replied, not lowering the gun by a single degree, "is the most convenient thing you could possibly say because it means you are either Walter Bishop or you are a liar. And if you are a liar, you are a dead one. So which is it?" He raised both hands slowly. "Walter Bishop. Born Laramie, Wyoming, 1851. This is my land, my desk, my chair you are sitting in, and my patience, which is also running thin." A beat passed, the longest beat of his life. Then she lowered the hammer with the practiced click of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and set the gun on the desk with a gentleness that seemed almost affectionate. "Theresa Quinn," she said, "I wrote you 3 letters. You never wrote back." He had not written back because he had thrown all 3 letters into the fire without reading them. He had thrown them into the fire because they had arrived with the stamp of the Wyoming Women's Labor Agency on the envelope, and the Wyoming Women's Labor Agency had been sending him letters about a bookkeeper position for 2 months, and Walter Bishop did not hire women. Not on this ranch. Not after what had happened. Not ever again. That was the rule. He stood in the doorway of his own office and looked at Theresa Quinn sitting in his chair, and he tried to remember why he had made it. He could not. She was looking back at him with dark eyes that held absolutely no apology, and the rule that had been the foundation of his life for 6 years cracked straight down the middle like winter ice under a man's boot. And Walter Bishop understood, standing in that doorway in the amber light of an August afternoon in 1884, that everything was about to change. He just did not know yet whether it would destroy him or save him. He did not know yet that it would be both. The story had begun 2 months earlier with a ledger book. Walter's ranch, the Broken Spur, was 22,000 acres of Wyoming grassland east of Cheyenne, and it ran cattle the way a river runs water, constantly, powerfully, with a force that required immense organization to keep from flooding into chaos. Walter was good at cattle. He was good at horses. He was good at reading weather and reading men and reading the land the way other people read books. What he was not good at, had never been good at, had stubbornly refused to become good at, was numbers. His previous bookkeeper, a dry, precise man named Aldous Hartley, had kept the ranch's accounts in perfect order for 11 years. Then Aldous Hartley had gone and died of a heart seizure in June, quietly and without warning, slumping over the very ledger books he had kept with such devotion, and Walter had been left with 3 months of unrecorded transactions, 2 competing invoices from the Cheyenne feed supplier, and a tax assessment from the county that may or may not have been fraudulent. He had placed the advertisement. He had received 43 responses. He had hired a man named Coleman Graves, who had lasted exactly 9 days before Walter discovered he was systematically skimming from the petty cash. He had then hired a second man named Percy Welch, who who had lasted 4 days before it became clear that Percy Welch could not actually read numbers with any accuracy and had simply been very good at sounding like he could. It was his foreman, a weathered Texan named Cody Hatch, who had suggested the women's labor agency. "They send out educated women," Cody said, with the careful tone of a man introducing a concept he expected to be rejected. "School teachers, bookkeepers, telegraphers. Some of them are real sharp, boss. I heard the Miller outfit over in Casper hired a woman to run their books 2 years ago, and she sorted out a fraud situation that saved them near $5,000. Walter had looked at Cody the way he looked at rattlesnakes, with a flat acknowledgement that the thing existed and a firm decision to walk in the opposite direction. "No," he said. "Boss, no." Cody had dropped it. But the letters had come anyway because someone, and Walter privately suspected it was Cody, had sent the inquiry to the agency without waiting for permission. The first letter had arrived in July. Walter had burned it. The second had arrived in early August. Walter had burned that one too. He had been in town when the third arrived, and by the time he got back to the ranch, Theresa Quinn had already been there for 4 hours, having read the advertisement in the agency's bulletin herself, having made the journey from Laramie on the Union Pacific, and having been welcomed by Cody Hatch, who was either the bravest or the most foolish man Walter had ever employed. She had been sitting at the desk because she had already been reviewing the ledger books. She had the colt because Harlan Doyle's men had ridden past the ranch gate at midday, making the kind of noise that told her immediately that something dangerous was circling the property. And she had asked Cody where the firearms were kept, and Cody had told her, and she had helped herself. Walter learned all of this in the first 10 minutes after the standoff in the doorway, delivered in Theresa Quinn's precise, unhurried manner as she laid it out like a legal brief, fact by fact, implication by implication. "You need to leave," he said when she finished. "You need someone who can read those ledger books," she replied. "I have already found 2 accounting errors in the July records that together represent a discrepancy of $312. Would you like to know where the money went?" He stared at her. "Sit down, Mr. Bishop," she said. "Not in my chair." It was his chair. He sat in the one across from it. He hated himself for sitting. He hated more how naturally it had happened, how her quiet authority had simply extended across the room and pulled him down into the seat without drama or force. "The money went to a supplier account that does not exist," she said, opening the ledger and turning it to face him, her finger tracing a column of figures with the sureness of long practice. "Someone created a fictional invoice here and here, routed payments through a false account name. This is not accounting error. This is deliberate fraud. Someone on your payroll, Mr. Bishop, has been stealing from you." The room was very still. Outside, the late August wind moved through the long grass with a sound like breathing. "How do you know that?" he asked. "Because I have seen this pattern before," she said. "I worked as a bookkeeper for the Laramie Land Trust for 4 years. I identified a similar scheme in their accounts in 1881. The man responsible was tried and convicted. I testified at the trial." Walter Bishop looked at Theresa Quinn for a long moment. She looked back at him with the steady patience of someone who had been underestimated enough times to have stopped being surprised by it, and started simply waiting for the moment when the person in front of her caught up. He did not say what he was thinking, which was that he had never in his life met anyone, man or woman, who could walk into a stranger's ledger books and find a fraud in 4 hours. What he said was, "You can stay for 2 weeks, on a trial basis. You sleep in the house in the east room, door locked. You are an employee, nothing more. You do not make decisions about this ranch without consulting me. And you do not," he added with an emphasis that he meant to be final, "go anywhere near my personal correspondence." "Agreed," she said. "Though I should tell you that Harlan Doyle's men have been past the gate 3 times in the last 2 days, and whatever they are watching for, it is not cattle." He had almost forgotten about Harlan Doyle. Almost. The truth was that he had not forgotten about Harlan Doyle for a single day in the last 3 years. Because Harlan Doyle, was the source of a slow-burning threat that Walter had been navigating with extreme care. The way you navigate a fire that has not yet reached your house, but is moving steadily in your direction. Harlan Doyle owned the Cross Creek spread to the north, twice the size of the Broken Spur, and he wanted Walter's water rights. The creek that ran through the southern quarter of the Broken Spur fed Doyle's pasture land in drought years, and Doyle had been trying to buy, bully, and legally maneuver his way into controlling that water for going on 3 years. Walter had refused every approach. In response, Doyle had become the kind of enemy who does not shoot you directly but creates the conditions in which you shoot yourself. The fraud in the ledgers, Walter now suspected, was not coincidental. "Tell me more about the false account," he said, and Theresa Quinn told him. She told him with the precision and depth of someone who had spent the afternoon not just reviewing figures but building a theory, and the theory was comprehensive and damning. And by the time she finished, Walter understood that the thief in his books and Harlan Doyle's campaign against him were almost certainly connected. He also understood that without Theresa Quinn, he would never have known it. That night, after supper, Walter sat on the porch of the ranch house and tried to remember the rule. He had made it after Anna. That was the honest truth of it, though he rarely let himself be that honest. Anna Larson, who had come to the Broken Spur as a cook's assistant in the spring of 1878, who had been bright and lovely and laughing, who had drawn him out of himself in ways he had not thought possible after Eleanor's death. He had fallen in love with Anna with the particular desperation of a lonely man who has been alone too long, and she had seemed to love him back. And then it had come out, gradually and then all at once, that Anna was engaged to a man in Denver, had been engaged the entire time, and that the attachment Walter had believed was mutual had been, on her side, a combination of loneliness and, he suspected, a calculated interest in the security the ranch represented. He had not been destroyed by it. He was not a man who destroyed easily, but he had been diminished by it, had felt the specific humiliation of having been seen wanting something and not receiving it, and that humiliation had hardened into a rule. No women hired on this property, not because they were less capable, because he was less capable around them, and he could not afford to be less capable. He had held that rule for 6 years without a single exception. He sat on the porch and looked at the dark prairie and listened to the coyotes in the distance and tried, sincerely, to muster the version of himself that had made that rule. That version seemed very far away. The first week passed in a state of careful, mutual wariness that felt, paradoxically, like the most honest relationship Walter Bishop had been in for years. Theresa Quinn was not what he had expected, though he could not have articulated precisely what he had expected, since he had tried so hard not to think about it. She was 28 years old, with dark hair worn practical and pinned, and eyes that were almost black and that moved over things with a quick assessment that reminded Walter of the way good horses look at unfamiliar terrain, alert without being afraid. She was not tall. She was not, by conventional frontier measure, soft. There was a directness to her that some people would have called unfeminine and that Walter found, with a discomfort he kept firmly to himself, almost unbearably interesting. She worked the way he worked, which was early and hard and without drama. She was at the desk by 6 in the morning, the ledger book spread before her, a cup of coffee beside her, making notes in a hand so precise it looked printed. She did not ask for help with things she could do herself. She did not perform uncertainty to seem more agreeable. When she did not know something, she asked, directly, without preamble, and when she had the answer she filed it away and did not need to be told again. On the 3rd day, she found the second layer of the fraud. She came to find him in the east pasture where he was working a young horse on a long line, and she stood at the fence rail with the patience of someone who understood that the horse's work was important and waited until he was ready to stop. "There is a second set of books," she said when he walked over. He looked at her. "Someone has been keeping a parallel record," she said. "Not in the main ledger, in the supply requisition logs." "I almost missed it," The figures are recorded in a different hand, smaller margin notations, but when you cross-reference them against the bank statements, the pattern is unmistakable. Someone has been systematically documenting the theft, not to expose it but to track it, as though they were keeping a record for their own purposes. Walter understood immediately what that meant. Insurance, he said. They were keeping leverage. Yes, said Theresa, which means the person doing this expected that at some point someone might try to cut them loose, and they wanted proof they could use. That narrows it considerably, Walter said. That is not a cowhand trying to skim a few dollars. That is someone who thinks about contingencies. Someone who has been on this property long enough to understand how it works, Theresa agreed. Someone with access to both the accounting records and the supply logs. He did not say the name they were both thinking. He looked out over the pasture for a moment, at the grass moving in the slow August wind, at the horses standing still in the far corner. I need to verify something, he said. I know, she said. I will have more detailed notes for you by evening. She turned to walk back to the house. He watched her go with an attention he told himself was simply professional regard. It was not simply professional regard. That evening, after supper, she showed him the full picture. She had spent the afternoon building a complete account of the fraud, every false invoice, every diverted payment, every parallel notation, laid out in a timeline that covered 17 months. The money has been flowing to a bank account in Cheyenne, she said. The account name is false, but the deposits follow a pattern. They increase in size and frequency in the months immediately following your rejections of Doyle's purchase offers. The last major deposit was made 2 weeks after you refused his attorneys in May. Walter looked at the timeline for a long time. Doyle is not just after my water rights, he said slowly. He is trying to bankrupt me. He is trying to make the ranch unsustainable, Theresa said. Drain the operating account slowly enough that you don't notice until it's too late, then either force a sale or create grounds for legal action. If he can show financial mismanagement in your accounts, he could challenge your land title. The room felt very quiet. Outside, the summer night made its small sounds, crickets and wind and the distant movement of horses. You figured all of this out from ledger books, Walter said. It was not a question. It was something else, something closer to wonder, though he would not have used that word. She looked at him with those steady, dark eyes. Numbers tell stories, she said. Most people think they are just figures, but every transaction is a decision, and every decision reveals something about the person who made it. If you know how to read them, the books tell you almost everything. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How do we prove it?" And she smiled just slightly, just enough, and said, "I already have a plan." The plan was elegant. It was also, Walter recognized with the particular admiration of a man who appreciated competence, significantly better than anything he would have come up with himself. Theresa had identified that the false bank account in Cheyenne was drawing funds through a series of small transfers that, individually, fell below the threshold of triggering scrutiny from the county tax assessor. The transfers were being authorized using a stamp that appeared, to a casual reader, to bear Walter's signature. "It is a forgery," she said. "A good one, but a forgery. I can prove it is a forgery because the signature uses a pen nib that was not available from Cheyenne suppliers until February of this year, but several of the earliest forged authorizations bear it, which means they were backdated. The forger made a mistake." "You know pen nibs," he said. "I know everything about the tools that produce financial documents," she said, with a matter-of-factness that was somehow both modest and astonishing. "It is my profession." Walter Bishop, who had spent 6 years being the most competent person in every room he occupied on the Broken Spur Ranch, sat with the quiet, unfamiliar, not entirely unpleasant experience of being in the presence of someone more competent than him at something important. He did not feel threatened by it. That surprised him. He felt something warmer and more complicated, something that had no name yet but was building in the space between them with the inevitability of weather. They went to Cheyenne on a Friday. riding the 12 miles in a wagon because Theresa had the ledger books and the documentation carefully wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from the August dust. Walter drove. Theresa sat beside him on the wagon seat with the oilcloth package in her lap and the Colt at her hip, because Doyle's men had been seen on the North Road that morning. They did not speak much for the first few miles. The prairie opened around them, wide and golden in the late summer light, the sky overhead the particular Wyoming blue that looked painted rather than real. "Why did you come?" Walter asked eventually. "You had a position in Laramie. You had history there. Why answer an advertisement in a territory you'd never worked in?" She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the grass. "The man I identified in the Laramie fraud," she said, "had powerful friends. After the trial, those friends made my position at the land trust uncomfortable. Not impossible, but uncomfortable. I was passed over for a promotion that I had earned. My work was given less authority. Nothing was said directly. Nothing had to be said directly." "They made you feel unwelcome," Walter said. "They made me feel provisional," she said, with a precision that made the word feel heavier than it usually did. "As though my position depended on their tolerance rather than my competence." "I am not good at provisional." He thought about that. The wagon rolled on. A hawk circled low over the grass ahead of them, hunting. "I am not good at provisional either," he said. She glanced at him. It was a quick glance, but it carried something, an assessment, a recognition. "I know," she said. "I read the letters you sent to the previous bookkeeper applicants. Cody Hatch showed them to me. Every one of them was clear, specific, and contained more conditions than most men put in a legal contract." He felt a flash of something that might have been embarrassment. "I know what I need," he said. "You know what you do not want to risk," she said, gently but without softness. "Those are different things." He did not answer that. The hawk dove and came up empty and wheeled away north, but he thought about it for the rest of the ride to Cheyenne. The meeting with the county clerk and the assistant district attorney went better than Walter had allowed himself to hope. Theresa presented the evidence with the composed authority of someone who had done this before, which she had, and the men across the desk, who had begun the meeting with the slightly glazed expressions of people expecting routine business, grew progressively more alert as the full scope of what she was presenting became clear. The forged signatures, the false account, the timeline connecting the fraud to Doyle's campaign, the backdating error with the pen nibs, which she demonstrated by producing samples of the nib type and documentation of its distribution date that she had obtained, Walter discovered with amazement, by writing to the manufacturer in Pittsburgh before they had even left the ranch. By the end of the meeting, the assistant district attorney had ordered a warrant for the examination of the Cheyenne bank account and requested that Walter provide a formal deposition. He had also asked, with the careful phrasing of a man recalibrating his assumptions in real time, whether Miss Quinn would be available to assist with the investigation. She said she would, contingent on her employer's agreement. Walter, who had become her employer approximately 10 days ago and who was still somewhat uncertain how that had happened, said yes. On the ride back, the late afternoon sun turning the prairie copper and long shadows stretching from every rise, Walter said, "You planned to go to them before you even arrived at the ranch." "I planned to have something worth taking to them before I went," she said. "There is a difference. I did not know what I would find in the books. I knew only that something was wrong, because your advertisements mentioned financial difficulties without specifying their nature, and the pattern of the difficulties you described did not match a badly run ranch." "How could you tell that from an advertisement?" "Because you described cash flow problems alongside strong cattle numbers," she said. "If the ranch were genuinely struggling, the cattle numbers would reflect it. A profitable operation losing money to fraud looks exactly like what you described." He stared at the road ahead for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "You are extraordinary." She turned to look at him. It was a different look than the quick assessment she gave him when she was evaluating what he'd said. This was slower and more uncertain, as though the word had landed somewhere she hadn't been expecting to receive it. "I am competent," she said. "There is a difference." "Not always," he said. The silence between them on the rest of the ride home was a different kind of silence than the one on the way out. It had warmth in it. It had the particular quality of two people in the same space who have both just felt something shift and are both, for the moment, choosing not to name it. The trap came from a direction neither of them had fully anticipated. It was Doyle's lawyer who moved first, not Doyle himself. A man named Prescott arrived at the Broken Spur 3 days after the Cheyenne meeting, riding in on a fine gray horse with the unhurried confidence of a man carrying legal weight. He had a document. The document purported to show that the ranch's operating account was overdrawn by a figure that, if accurate, would have triggered a provision in Walter's original land title agreement allowing the mortgage holder to call the debt. Walter read it twice. His jaw was tight. "This is manufactured," he said. "I would need to see your bank records," Theresa said from across the room. She had appeared in the doorway of the study when she heard Prescott arrive, as though she had been waiting. Prescott looked at her with the flat assessment men like him gave to women in professional spaces. "This is a matter between myself and Mr. Bishop. Miss Quinn is my bookkeeper," Walter said flatly. "She has full access to the financial records of this ranch. Anything you put in front of me, you put in front of her." Prescott's eyes moved back to Walter with a readjustment that he tried not to show. He set the document on the desk. Theresa picked it up, she read it, she turned it over, she held it up to the window light. Then she said, "This document cites a balance sheet dated August 14th. The Union Bank in Cheyenne does not produce balance sheets on the 14th of any month. They run on the last day of the month. This is either an internal document which would require a bank officer's cooperation to generate, or it is a forgery. Either way, it is not a valid legal instrument for the purpose it is being used." Prescott went very still. "Furthermore," she continued, her voice maintaining the same even tone, "the provision it attempts to invoke requires 30 days written notice before any debt can be called. No such notice has been received by this ranch. I know because I have reviewed all correspondence received in the last 3 months, and I would have noted it. You may not have access to all correspondence," Prescott began. "The provision also requires that the notice be filed with the county clerk simultaneously," she said. "I will take the liberty of sending a wire to the clerk's office this afternoon. If the filing exists, I will find it. If it does not exist, then this document is fraudulent, and you, Mr. Prescott, have just committed a legal act that will be of considerable interest to the district attorney with whom we met last Friday." The room was completely silent. Walter watched Prescott, who was making the rapid internal calculations of a man reassessing whether his principal's instructions were worth the personal exposure they apparently involved. "I will need to consult with my client," Prescott said. "I imagine you will," Theresa said. She held the document out to him with 2 fingers, the way you hand something back to someone when you want them to be clear that you are done with it. Prescott took it. He left. Walter stood in the study doorway and looked at Theresa Quinn, who was already moving back to the desk to draft the wire to the county clerk, and he felt the rule he had made 6 years ago with such iron certainty dissolve entirely, not with drama, not with grief, but with the quiet, irreversible finality of ice melting in spring. It was gone. It had been gone for days. He had simply been too stubborn to stop standing where it used to be. That evening, Cody Hatch came to find Walter in the barn where he was working late on a harness repair, the particular kind of repetitive manual work Walter did when he needed to think. "You know who it is," Cody said. "Not a question." Walter set down the harness. He had known for 2 days. He had been hoping he was wrong. He was not wrong. "Milner," he said. Cody exhaled slowly. Frank Milner had been the ranch's supply manager for 4 years. He was competent, organized, and had access to both the accounting records and the supply requisition logs. He was also, Walter now understood, the man who had been systematically bleeding the broken spurs accounts in Doyle's service. "He has been good at his job," Cody said, with the particular weariness of a man who has been betrayed by someone he trusted. "He has been good at the job that let him do the other one," Walter said. The next morning, Walter confronted Frank Milner in the supply room with Cody as witness. He laid out what Theresa had found fact by fact: the false accounts, the forged signatures, the backdated documents, the parallel record that Milner had kept for leverage. He was calm. He was completely, precisely calm, the way he was calm with dangerous animals, not absent of feeling but in full control of it. Milner, to his credit, did not try to deny it. He was 40 years old and tired-looking, and the expression on his face when Walter finished speaking was not defiance but a kind of hollow resignation, the look of a man who had known this moment was coming and had been carrying the anticipation of it like a stone in his chest. "Doyle told me the ranch would go under anyway," Milner said. "That you were too stubborn to sell, and it would end badly regardless. He made it seem like I was just helping a natural process along." "And the money," Walter said. Milner looked at the floor. "He paid me, yes." Walter turned to Cody. "Take him to Cheyenne." It was over quickly, or as quickly as such things go in a territory where the law moves at the pace of the institutions available to enforce it. Milner was taken to Cheyenne. The district attorney, who already had the fraud investigation in motion, added his testimony to the case against Doyle. The bank account was frozen. The warrant was expanded. Harlan Doyle, faced with evidence that had been assembled with the systematic precision of someone who knew exactly what they were building, made the decision that powerful men sometimes make when cornered. He ran. He left the Cross Creek spread in the care of his foreman and took a train east, and the legal process ground forward without him. It would be 2 years before it was fully resolved. But on that September morning, standing outside the supply room with Cody riding toward Cheyenne and the ranch quiet around him, Walter Bishop felt the long pressure of 3 years of threat begin, finally, to lift. He found Theresa at her desk, as usual. She was working through the corrected accounts, rebuilding the accurate picture of the ranch's finances that the fraud had obscured. "It is done," he said. She looked up. "Not entirely," she said. "The legal process will take time, and you will need to build the supply accounts back carefully. There is also the matter of the tax assessment, which was almost certainly filed in bad faith, and I would recommend we address it before—" "Theresa," he said. She stopped. He looked at her for a moment, at this woman who had arrived with a gun already drawn and 3 unread letters, and the ability to see through a 17-month fraud in 4 hours, and he said, "Thank you." It was the simplest thing he could have said. It was also the most honest. She looked at him for a moment with something complicated in her dark eyes. "I am doing my job," she said. "You saved this ranch," he said. "You would have found it eventually," she said. "I would not have found it," he said. "Not in time. And we both know it." She did not argue with that. She looked down at the ledger books for a moment, and when she looked back up, there was something slightly different in her expression, something that had dropped one of its layers of professional distance. "You are welcome," she said. He left her to her work, but he stood in the hallway outside the study for a moment, hand on the doorframe, and let himself feel what he had been carefully not feeling for 2 weeks. It was considerable. September came in with cooler nights, and the first turning of the cottonwood leaves along the creek to gold. The ranch settled into the steady rhythm of autumn work, the preparation for winter, the final cattle drive before the season closed, the laying in of supplies. Walter worked the days hard and ate supper at the long table in the kitchen with Cody and the 2 remaining ranch hands, and Theresa ate there too, and the conversation over those autumn suppers was the most natural Walter had felt in a shared space in years. She was funny, which surprised him. Not in the performing way, not the social humor of someone trying to make themselves liked, but the dry, unexpected humor of someone who simply saw things at a slight angle from the conventional view and occasionally said so. One evening, when one of the ranch hands, a young man named Arlo, was trying to explain why his horse had somehow ended up on the wrong side of a fence during the afternoon's work. She said, without looking up from her coffee, "I believe the phrase you are looking for is, 'the horse disagreed with my decision.' And in my experience, when a horse disagrees with a decision, the horse is usually right." Arlo had laughed until he nearly fell off his chair. Cody had grinned into his coffee. And Walter had looked at her sideways with something in his chest that was warm and dangerous, and entirely outside the boundaries he had spent years constructing. He went for a ride one morning in early September, the good blue roan he kept for his own use, out to the southern quarter where the creek ran low but clear through the willows, the water catching the early light in small silver flashes. He sat on the bank for a while, the horse grazing loose behind him, and had the honest conversation with himself that he had been postponing. He was falling in love with Theresa Quinn. He was not in the early, uncertain stages of it. He was well along. He had been falling since the moment in the doorway when she had looked at him over the barrel of that Colt, with those black, intelligent eyes, and the absolute absence of fear. He had been falling harder with every day since, with every demonstration of her precise and formidable mind, with every dry observation at the supper table, with the way she stood at the fence watching him work a horse with a quiet attentiveness that told him she was filing it away, understanding something new about who he was. He loved her capability. He loved her directness. He loved that she did not pretend to be less than she was to make him comfortable. He loved that she had never, not once, looked at him with the particular softness people gave him when they wanted something, because she never wanted anything from him that she was not willing to earn directly. He sat by the creek and thought about Anna, about the rule he had made because of her. He understood now that the rule had not been about women. It had been about himself, about the specific vulnerability of being a solitary man with a great deal to protect and a tendency to give his whole heart once he gave it at all. The rule had been protection from that, but protection was not the same as strength. He had mistaken one for the other for 6 years. He rode back to the ranch and did not say anything that morning. But something in the way he moved through the day was different, and Cody, who had known him for 12 years, noticed it and said nothing because he was Cody, but he noticed it. The situation came to a head, as situations tend to do, not because Walter planned it but because of weather. The storm rolled in from the northwest on a Thursday afternoon in late September with the particular speed of Wyoming storms that have no manners and no warning. The sky going from clear to green-gray in 40 minutes, the wind rising from nothing to urgent, the temperature dropping 10 degrees in the time it took to walk from the barn to the house. Walter was out riding the north fence line when it hit. He got back to the ranch in the driving rain, cold through to the bone, his horse dancing under him with the spook that horses get in bad weather, and he came into the barn and stripped the saddle and rubbed the horse down with the focused speed of a man who does things right even when he is cold and tired, and then he walked to the house. Theresa was in the kitchen. She had apparently been there for some time, because there was bread baked and cooling on the rack, and a pot of something substantial on the iron stove, and a lamp lit against the early dark of the storm. She looked at him when he came in, dripping and red-faced from the cold, and without a word or any visible hesitation, she moved to the stove and poured a cup of coffee and set it on the table. He sat down. He wrapped both hands around the cup. The warmth moved into him slowly. "How bad is it?" she asked, going back to the stove. "Fence is holding. The cattle are pushed to the south pasture. They will be all right. Arlo and the others are in the bunkhouse." He paused. "Cody is in town." "He went this morning before the weather turned." She nodded. She was quiet for a moment, stirring the pot. "You have been different this week," she said, without turning around. He was quiet. "Not badly different," she said. "Just different, watching something." He looked at her back, the straight line of her shoulders, the efficient movements of someone entirely comfortable in her own body, in her own presence. "Theresa," he said. She turned. The lamplight made her face warm, made shadows in the planes of her expression that were more open than usual, perhaps because of the storm, the intimacy of enclosed space, the stripped-back quality of weather that makes pretense feel silly. "I am aware," she said carefully, "that what I am going to say may be unwelcome, and if it is, I would ask that we simply agree to leave it unsaid and continue the arrangement as it is, because the work here is important and I do not want to." "Theresa," he said again. She stopped. "I have been sitting on this for 3 weeks," he said. "Let me say it first." She looked at him. He stood up from the table because there were things that could not be said sitting down. He stood up and he said, "I have a rule. I made it 6 years ago, and I have not broken it once in all that time. The rule was that I do not allow feelings for women I employ. I made it because I had been hurt and I did not trust myself, and I thought the rule would protect something important." He paused. She was very still, watching him with those dark, careful eyes. "You arrived 3 weeks ago, and I cannot remember why I made it," he said. "I have tried. I have ridden to the creek and had the honest conversation with myself, and I have tried every angle. But when I try to build the argument for the rule, the only thing I can see is you, and the argument falls apart." The storm moved against the windows. The lamp flickered once. "I am not telling you this as your employer," he said. "I am suspending that distinction for this moment, and telling you this as a man who has been watching you for 3 weeks, and has found something in you that he did not know he was looking for. You are the most capable person I have ever met. You are the most honest person I have encountered since my wife died. And you are the only person who has ever made me feel that being in the presence of someone stronger than me in a given thing is not a threat, but a gift." The kitchen was very quiet under the sound of the rain. Theresa Quinn stood by the stove with the lamp making her face warm and uncertain and more open than he had seen it, and she said, "I came here for a job." "I know," he said. "I am not in the habit of this," she said, with the first imprecision of speech he had ever heard from her, and it moved him more than almost anything else she had done. "Neither am I," he said. "I spent 6 years making sure of it." A long beat passed. The wind pressed at the house with the casual force of October. "I noticed you," she said at last, quietly. "I noticed you the first day. I told myself it was because I needed to understand who I was working for." "Was it only that?" he asked. She looked at him with the directness that was simply who she was, the directness that had made him trust her before he had any rational reason to. "No," she said. "It was not only that." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps. He stopped in front of her, close but not touching, because she was not a woman you touched without invitation, and he was not a man who did. "I would like to court you," he said, "properly, with the understanding that you are here on your own terms and this does not change your employment or your authority in the work you do here, and with the understanding that if you would rather not, I will respect that completely and we will never speak of it again." She looked up at him. He was significantly taller, and she did not seem the slightest bit diminished by the difference. "Properly," she said, with the slightest edge of the dry humor he had come to love. "As properly as is possible on a cattle ranch in Wyoming during a thunderstorm," he said, and she smiled. The full version, not the small controlled one she gave to things that were merely interesting, but the real one, the one that changed her whole face and made her look like the version of herself she was when no one was watching. "All right," she said. Outside, the storm reached its peak and began to soften. They ate supper together in the warm kitchen while the rain gentled against the windows, and they talked the way people who are discovering each other talk, not about the ranch or the fraud or the legal proceedings, but about themselves. Walter told her about growing up in Laramie, about his father who had homesteaded the original quarter section and worked himself into the ground doing it, about Alina, his first wife, who had died of fever in the 2nd year of their marriage and left a silence in him that had taken a long time to fill with anything else. Theresa told him about her father, a circuit judge who had moved the family across 4 territories in her childhood, so that she had grown up with the law as familiar furniture rather than abstract authority. About the education she had taken at a female seminary in Missouri that had been one of the few institutions of its kind teaching mathematics and accountancy to women. About Laramie, where she had arrived at 24 with her certification and the confident intention of being taken seriously, and the years of careful, relentless proving of herself that had followed. Did it ever feel like too much, he asked. The constant proving. She considered this honestly. It felt like the work, she said. I did not always separate them. Maybe I should have. She looked at her coffee cup. There were moments when I was tired, not of the work. Of the fact that the work was never quite enough to settle the question for good, that I would have to prove it again with the next person. You will not have to prove it here, he said. She looked at him with that careful, assessing look. You say that. I mean it, he said. I have watched you work. The question is settled. The assessing look softened into something else. You are, she said, a more straightforward person than I expected. Is that a complaint? No, she said with the smile again. It is a relief. October moved in golden and cool, and the courting was, as Walter had promised, as proper as Wyoming allowed. He brought her wildflowers once, which made her look at him with such surprised delight that he felt slightly foolish and entirely satisfied simultaneously. He rode with her on Sunday afternoons when the work allowed it, out into the open country where the light fell long and the sky went on forever, and they talked and occasionally fell into companionable silence that was worth more than most conversations he had ever had. He read to her in the evenings from the books on the ranch's small shelf, which she had supplemented with her own, a surprising collection that ranged from legal texts to poetry, to a well-worn copy of Darwin that she had clearly read multiple times. She, for her part, was courted the way she did everything, with her full intelligence applied to the situation and no pretense. She asked him questions about the ranch that were not bookkeeper questions, but genuine curiosity about the thing he had built and loved. She watched him with the horses with an interest that was not performative. She challenged him when she disagreed with him, cleanly and without venom, and acknowledged when he was right with the same directness, no more qualified than necessary. She also, one morning in mid-October, delivered the final report to the district attorney that sealed the fraud case against Harlan Doyle's operation, a 60-page document that she had compiled with the thoroughness of someone who wanted there to be no question, no possible avenue of challenge, no way for a powerful man with legal resources to wriggle free of what he had done. The assistant DA had read it and then looked up at Theresa across his desk with an expression that Walter, who was sitting against the wall, recognized immediately as the particular expression of a person being confronted with superior ability. "Miss Quinn," he said, "have you ever considered reading for the bar?" Theresa had looked at him steadily and said, "Women are not admitted to the bar in Wyoming territory." The DA had shifted slightly in his chair with the discomfort of a man receiving a correction he deserved. "That may change," he said carefully. "I know," she said. "When it does, I will consider it." Walter had looked at her sideways on the ride home and said very quietly, "Would you, if it changes?" She had thought about it for a while, watching the prairie. "Perhaps," she said. "But I think I prefer the numbers. The law is stories. The numbers are truth." He had thought about that for the rest of the ride. The first time he kissed her was not planned and was not cinematic. It was the last day of October, the autumn nearly finished, the first real cold of the season in the air. They were standing by the corral in the early evening watching his best mare with a new foal, the foal still leggy and uncertain on its feet in the way of very young horses, and Theresa had made a sound of pure uncalculated delight at something the foal did. A small, unguarded sound that was nothing like her usual composed self, and Walter had looked at her profile against the evening sky, at the gladness in her face that she had not had time to manage, and he had simply, without premeditation, turned and kissed her. It was brief, just a moment. Just the warmth of it and the surprise of it, and then the space after it where they both stood very still. She did not move away. She turned to look at him with those dark eyes that were wide for just a moment before the careful intelligence moved back into them, and she said, "I was not finished watching the foal." And he laughed genuinely and fully, which was something he had not done in years and which felt, in that cool autumn evening by the corral, like a door opening. "The foal will still be there," he said. "So will that," she said, with a precision that made clear what she meant, and turned back to the mare and foal with the slight smile of someone who has said exactly the right thing and knows it. He stood beside her and watched the foal finding its legs, and the evening settled around them like it belonged to them, and he thought, with the quiet certainty of a man who has lived long enough to know the feeling, that this was happiness. Real, grounded, unperformative happiness, the kind that does not arrive with fanfare but simply settles in one day, and you realize it has been there for some time. November brought the legal resolution of the Doyle matter, or the beginning of it. Harlan Doyle, who had been located in Kansas City, was extradited to face the charges in Wyoming territory. His lawyer, Prescott, had already made a cooperation arrangement with the district attorney's office that would reduce his own exposure in exchange for testimony. Milner, from the county jail in Cheyenne, had also provided a full statement. The fraud case was solid, built on the foundation of Theresa's exhaustive documentation, and even the most skilled defense attorney would have struggled to find gaps in it. The charges included fraud, forgery, conspiracy to commit financial harm, and attempted interference with property rights. Walter received the update by telegraph on a cold November morning and read it in the kitchen while Theresa was at her desk and Cody was checking the morning readings on the thermometer outside. He took the telegram to the study and laid it on the desk before her. She read it. She read it twice, the way she read things, and then she set it down and was quiet for a moment. "It is not finished," she said. "The trial will take time." "I know," he said, "but it is turning the right direction." She looked at the telegram for another moment. Then she said, "There is something I should tell you. The district attorney contacted me last week. He has asked whether I would be willing to serve as an expert witness in the trial, formally with compensation. It would require time in Cheyenne, possibly several weeks." He looked at her, and I said I would need to speak to you first," she said, "because it would disrupt the bookkeeping work here during a time when the accounts are still being rebuilt." "Can you do both?" he asked. She thought about it. "I can manage the accounts around the schedule if I am organized about it. The testimony itself is not the time-consuming part, the preparation is." "Then yes," he said. "Of course yes." She looked at him for a moment longer as though checking something. "You are sure?" "Theresa," he said, "you built that case. There is no question of you seeing it through." The look she gave him then was not the professional assessment or the dry amusement. It was something quieter and deeper, something that had the quality of being believed in, which was, he was beginning to understand, not something she had experienced consistently enough to take for granted. "Thank you," she said. He went back to his work. But he felt, walking down the hallway, the particular satisfaction of having said the right thing to the right person, which was its own kind of rare. Christmas came to the broken spur with the snow it almost always brought, deep and blue-shadowed in the cottonwoods, the creek running slow under its ice shelf, the cattle in the south pasture standing patient and steam-breathed in the cold. Cody's wife, a small, sharp-tongued woman named Mabel who Walter had known for a decade, came out from town for the week and filled the ranch house with the particular energy of a person who views any space she occupies as immediately improvable. Mabel Hatch approved of Theresa with an efficiency that suggested she had made up her mind approximately 20 minutes after meeting her. "Finally," Mabel said to Walter, in a tone that made no attempt to be quiet on the second day of the visit. "Someone who talks sense in this house." Walter, who had previously considered himself the primary source of sense in the house, elected to let this pass without comment. The holiday brought with it a conversation that Walter had been approaching for weeks, circling it the way you circle a decision you know you have to make but want to be sure of before you make it. On Christmas Eve, after supper, after Cody and Mabel had gone to the bunkhouse they had been given for the week, and the house was quiet with the particular quality of winter nights on the prairie, Walter and Theresa sat by the fireplace. She had a book in her lap but was not reading it. He was watching the fire. The 2-week trial period ended in September, he said. She looked up. You are still here, he said. I am still here, she agreed. I would like you to stay, he said. Not as a trial arrangement, not as a provisional employee. He paused. I am asking improperly, probably. The order of things suggests I should have a ring and a plan and a better setting than a ranch house on Christmas Eve. She turned fully to face him, setting the book aside. I have been thinking about what you said, he said. About provisional. About how you came here because you were tired of your position depending on someone's tolerance. I want you to understand that if you stay here, it would not be on those terms. I would want you here because you choose to be, because this is yours as much as it is mine. Because the work you do on this ranch is as essential as anything I do, and I intend for that to be the actual arrangement, not just the words. He looked at her. The firelight moved over her face. I am asking you to marry me, he said. If you want to, and I want to be clear that I am asking you because I love you, because you are the most extraordinary person I know, because the months since you arrived have been the most alive I have felt since I do not know when, not because I need a bookkeeper, though God knows I do. The fire crackled. Outside, the December wind moved through the cottonwoods. Theresa Quinn, who had faced a fraud ring and a corrupt land agent and 15 years of being underestimated in professional spaces with absolute composure, looked at Walter Bishop in the firelight with something that was not composed at all. It was open and warm and a little unsteady in the way of things that are genuinely felt rather than managed. Yes, she said, just that, clean and direct and entirely herself. He crossed the distance between them and took her hands in both of his, and they sat together in the firelight with the Wyoming winter pressing gently at the windows. And it felt, to both of them, like the particular completion of something that had been quietly building since the moment she had walked into a stranger's life with a gun already drawn, and the ability to see through a year and a half of carefully constructed lies. They were married in February, in the Cheyenne courthouse, because Theresa said she would rather be married by the law she respected than by a ceremony she did not believe in, and because February in Wyoming makes elaborate outdoor arrangements logistically inadvisable. Cody stood with Walter. Mabel stood with Theresa and cried with the focused intensity of a woman who had been waiting for something to cry at for some time. The assistant district attorney was there, because he had become, in the course of the Doyle proceedings, something close to a friend of both of them, and he brought a bottle of good bourbon that was opened immediately after the ceremony in the small room adjacent to the clerk's office. The Doyle trial had been moved to spring, which gave them the winter to themselves, the long, quiet months that are a particular kind of gift on a Wyoming ranch, when the work narrows to the essential, and the days are short, and the evenings are long, and the snow makes the world small and close and warm. They worked well together, which was not a surprise, but they also simply lived well together, which was the thing Walter had not let himself imagine during the years of the rule. They had the same tolerance for silence and the same impatience with unnecessary complication, and the same fundamental understanding that a day's work honestly done was its own reward. They disagreed regularly and productively on specific matters ranging from cattle breed selection to the appropriate response to the county commissioner's latest assessments, and the disagreements were among the most stimulating conversations Walter had had in 15 years of ranching. In March, with the trial approaching and the snow beginning to soften at the edges, and the first restless movement of the cattle telling him that spring was genuinely coming, Theresa told him quietly one evening that she thought she might be pregnant. He was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and a supply manifest, and he looked up at her with the particular expression of a man receiving news that is simultaneously expected and completely unexpected, the way the first of the season's good weather feels both inevitable and astonishing. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Not entirely," she said, "but I am fairly certain." He stood up. He crossed the kitchen and put his hands on her face, this woman who had walked into his life with a gun and a ledger book and the capacity to see truth in columns of numbers. And he said, "That is the best thing you have told me since you said yes." She put her hands over his and looked at him with that open expression that was still new enough to move him every time. "Do not get ahead of yourself," she said. "I said fairly certain." "Fairly certain is enough," he said. The Doyle trial was held in Cheyenne in April of 1885, in the Territorial Courthouse on Cary Avenue. Theresa testified for 2 days. She was precise, comprehensive, and entirely unruffled by the defense attorney's attempts to challenge her methodology or her qualifications, attempts she addressed with the patient, almost pedagogical detail of someone explaining the obvious to someone who is professionally obligated to pretend they do not understand it. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and returned a conviction on all primary counts. Harlan Doyle was sentenced to 7 years in the Territorial Prison. Milner, who had cooperated with the prosecution, received 3 years. Prescott, who had also cooperated, received a suspended sentence and the loss of his legal license. On the courthouse steps in the April sunshine, Walter stood beside his wife, who was 4 months along and not showing it in any obvious way yet, and he felt the specific lightness of a man who has been carrying a long-term threat and has been given permission to set it down. "It is done," he said. She took his arm. The April sun was warm on the limestone steps. Behind them the courthouse traffic moved and murmured. "Almost," she said. "There is still the matter of the Cross Creek water rights. With Doyle's conveyance under criminal sanction, those water agreements may be reviewable." He looked at her sideways. "I have already drafted a petition," she said. "I was going to show it to you this evening." He shook his head slowly with the smile he had learned to let come freely. "Theresa," he said, "you need the water access confirmed," she said. "Otherwise the South Pasture is at risk every drought year. It is a straightforward legal argument given the circumstances." "I know," he said. "I am not objecting. I am just—" he searched for the word. "What?" she asked. "Grateful," he said, "specifically and completely." She looked at him with those dark eyes in the April light, and the look had everything in it that the rule had been trying to keep out: the warmth, the intelligence, the complete and genuine seeing of a person by someone who looks without agenda, and she said, "I am as well." They walked down the courthouse steps into the Cheyenne afternoon together, and the streets were busy with the ordinary business of the territory in spring, and neither of them were looking back. The water rights petition was granted in July, the same month their son was born. They named him James, after Walter's father, James Arthur Bishop, born on a hot July morning with more noise and determination than any 7-pound person has reasonable right to produce. And Walter held him in the upstairs room of the ranch house, with the summer light coming through the curtains, and felt, with a completeness that left no room for the old loneliness, what it meant to have everything you needed in the same place. Theresa, who had managed the birth with the same focused competence she brought to everything, and was now lying in the big bed looking at the ceiling with the specific exhaustion of a woman who has just accomplished something genuinely enormous, said, "He has your nose." "God help him," Walter said. "It is a perfectly good nose," she said. "On a man of 33, Walter said. "On a person the size of a boot, it is a great deal of nose." She laughed, tiredly but genuinely, and Walter settled into the chair beside the bed with his son in his arms and the August light warm on the floor, and he thought about the rule. He thought about it the way you think about something that used to matter and no longer does, with a kind of historical affection, the way you feel about a younger, more frightened version of yourself. The rule had been his protection, his constructed wall against the specific vulnerability of wanting. He had made it out of pain, and had maintained it out of pride, and had believed, in the way of stubborn people, that the fact that it had never been broken proved its necessity. She had arrived, and he had not been able to remember why he had made it. Not because she had challenged it, or argued against it, or made him feel that it was wrong, but simply because her presence had made it irrelevant, The way a wall becomes irrelevant when you understand that the thing you were afraid of was not actually outside. The rule had kept him from risk. She had shown him what the risk was for. Summer deepened and the ranch moved forward in its eternal rhythms. The grass growing long in the south pasture with the water right secure, the cattle fat and healthy, the books balanced with the precision that Theresa's system had made the standard rather than the exception. Cody Hatch, who had quietly and without acknowledgement set all of this in motion by sending the inquiry to the Wyoming Women's Labor Agency, was never directly thanked for it, primarily because Walter could not decide whether to thank him or take a swing at him, and the uncertainty resolved itself into neither. On a Sunday afternoon in September, 1 year to the month after the storm that had cracked everything open in the kitchen, Walter and Theresa rode out to the Southern Creek, the same one Walter had ridden to alone a year ago to have the honest conversation with himself. They left James with Mabel Hatch, who had been visiting and who received the assignment with the satisfied air of someone who had been waiting to be given it. They rode without hurry through the late summer grass, the horses moving at an easy pace, the sky enormous and perfectly blue above them. The creek was running well, the best it had run in years, the water rights settlement having resolved the diversion issues that had plagued the lower reaches. They sat on the bank where Walter had sat alone the year before, the horses loose behind them, the water running clear over the rounded stones. "I keep thinking about the letters," Theresa said. "Which letters?" "The 3 I sent you that you burned," she said. "I know you burned them, Cody told me." Walter was quiet for a moment. "I burned them before I read them," he said. "I want that on the record." "It is on the record," she said. "What I keep thinking about is what would have happened if Cody had not sent the inquiry, if I had not seen the advertisement in the agency bulletin myself and decided to come regardless." He looked at her. "I would have gone somewhere else," she said. "Found another position. Done good work somewhere for someone who was slightly less stubborn and slightly more conventional and probably completely adequate." She paused. "I would have been fine." "But," he said. She looked at the water for a moment. "But I would not have had this," she said. "I would not have known that this was possible." He understood what she meant. Not the ranch, not the legal victory, not the material security of it. The this that was specific and irreplaceable, the particular shape of 2 people who fit together not because they were alike but because they were honest. "I would not have known either," he said. She leaned against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The creek moved past them with its small constant sound, and the cottonwoods were beginning their annual gold, and the prairie stretched away in every direction with the immensity that had never stopped moving him. 15 years of looking at it and it still moved him. "Cody deserves a raise," Theresa said. "Cody is getting a raise," Walter said. "He has been getting a raise since November." "Does he know?" "He has started getting it. He will know when he looks at his wages." She laughed softly. "You realize you are a better person than you let people know." "I have a reputation to maintain," he said. She said, which was a complete sentence when Theresa said it. They sat there until the afternoon began to cool, and the light turned amber, and the horses drifted closer to the bank for the water. Then they rode home through the turning autumn, through the land that had been the center of Walter Bishop's life for 15 years, and was now the center of something larger than he had known how to want. James had his mother's eyes, they discovered in the 2nd year of his life, the same dark, intelligent, slightly appraising look that had been the first thing Walter had noticed about Theresa standing in the doorway of the study. He also had his father's stubbornness, expressed as a determination to climb things that were significantly too tall for him, and to regard parental intervention in this project with thoughtful but complete indifference. He was 2 years old when the letter arrived from the Wyoming Territorial Legislature, forwarded through the district attorney's office, informing Theresa that the testimony and analysis she had provided in the Doyle proceedings had been cited in a proposed new statute regarding financial fraud in land transactions, and asking whether she would be willing to serve as a consultant to the drafting committee. She brought it to Walter at breakfast and watched him read it. "Are you going to?" he asked. "It would mean time in Cheyenne," she said. "Several trips, it could take months." He looked at her over James's head because James was sitting in his lap attempting to eat a piece of toast with a concentration that suggested it was the most complex task he had ever undertaken. "It is important work," Walter said. "It is," she agreed. "Go do it," he said. She looked at him. "Theresa," he said, "the work you do matters, here and beyond here. I knew that when I married you. I did not marry you to keep you small." She looked at him for a long moment with those dark eyes, and the look was the full version again, the open one, the one she had never learned to modulate because she had never quite believed it would be safe to show it. She was wrong about that. He had been showing her she was wrong about that for going on 2 years, and she was beginning to believe it. "I love you," she said. It was not a thing she said frequently or lightly, which made it, when she said it, the most valuable sentence in the room. "I know," he said, which was not deflection but simple truth, the good kind. "I love you too." James ate his toast with tremendous focus, entirely unconcerned with the feelings of adults. The years that followed were the years that matter, the ordinary, extraordinary years of two people building something together that is larger than either of them alone. The ranch grew. The water rights case had established a precedent that made the Broken Spur's southern pasture more productive than it had been in a decade, and Walter added a section of land to the east that carried good grass and a reliable spring. He hired well, having learned something from the Milner situation about the cost of misplaced trust, and the Broken Spur's crew over the years became known in the territory as a place where a man was treated fairly and paid honestly. Theresa's consulting work with the territorial legislature continued and expanded. By 1887, she was one of the most cited practical experts on financial fraud in Wyoming, a distinction that would have been formally recognized in a number of ways that the territory was not yet quite ready to offer a woman, but that was recognized practically in the steady stream of requests for her analysis that arrived at the ranch. She handled them from the study, at the desk that was now entirely hers, with the ledger books and the careful system she had built arranged around her. In 1888, their daughter was born. They named her Clara, and she had red hair that neither of them could account for, and a laugh that could be heard from 2 buildings away. James, who was 3 and had opinions about most things, declared her acceptable after a period of consideration. Walter sat in the chair by the window in the upstairs room with Clara in the crook of his arm and James leaning against his leg, looking at the new person with the assessing look that was so entirely Theresa's that it made Walter's chest tight with a kind of joy that was also grief, in the way that the deepest happiness sometimes is, because it includes the knowledge of what it cost to arrive here. "She is going to run things," James said, at 3 years old and already perceptive. "She might," Walter agreed. "Like Mama," James said. "Exactly like Mama," Walter said, and meant it as the highest possible praise. Theresa from the bed said, "James Arthur Bishop, I can hear you." "I said it like it was a good thing," James said, with the reasonable precision of a child who has grown up in a household where precision is valued. "Then you are forgiven," she said. The ranch was full of sound that evening, the particular sound of a house with children in it, which is a specific and irreplaceable music, and Walter sat with his daughter and his son, and the evening light moving across the floor, and he thought about the rule one more time. He thought about it the way you think about a locked door you used to stand in front of before you understood that the key had been in your pocket the whole time. He had made the rule to protect himself from the specific vulnerability of love, and in doing so had nearly missed the only love of the kind that sustains you, the kind that is built on respect and genuine knowing, and the particular grace of being seen clearly and chosen anyway. She had arrived with a gun already drawn and 3 unread letters, and an ability to see truth in columns of figures that had saved everything he had spent his life building. She had arrived, and the rule had become impossible to remember, not because she was what he wanted in some simple way, but because she was more than he had known to want, and the rule had been built on a smaller imagination of what was possible. He heard her moving around the room behind him, the quiet, competent movements that were entirely her, and he felt the warmth of her presence the way you feel warmth that has become so constant you would not know to name it except when you imagined its absence, and then it becomes unbearable to imagine. "Walter," she said. He turned. She was sitting up in the bed, her dark hair loose, looking at him with James half asleep against her side and the lamp making the room warm against the October darkness outside. "Come here," she said. He stood and carried Clara to the bed and sat beside her, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and James made the boneless shift of a child falling properly to sleep, and Clara lay perfect and small and furiously alive in his arms. Outside, the Wyoming night was enormous and clear, the stars coming out one by one over the wide, dark prairie, and the cottonwoods stood bare along the creek, and the cattle moved somewhere in the south pasture with their slow, patient sound. The Broken Spur Ranch was whole, the accounts were clean, the fraud was history, the threat was gone, the water ran freely to the south pasture, the land was secure. And Walter Bishop, who had made a rule that he had never broken, and had spent 6 years standing beside it like a sentinel at a post he had forgotten the reason for, held his daughter in the lamplight of his own house beside the woman who had arrived and made the reason irrelevant, and he was, with a completeness he had not believed was available to him, entirely happy. He could not remember the rule at all. He could not imagine why he had ever needed it. The cottonwoods went bare each November, and the snow came in December, and the spring arrived each April with its particular miracle of green returning to the long grass, and the years moved forward the way good years do, with work and purpose and the occasional difficulty that resolves into something better than before, and Walter and Theresa Bishop grew old on the land that she had helped him keep and that had become, long since, as much hers as his. The desk in the study and the horses in the corral and the creek in the south pasture, and the vast open sky that covered all of it. James, at 14, rode the fence line as his father once had, and had his mother's gift for pattern recognition and his father's patience, and was going to be formidable in ways that were not yet fully visible. Clara, at 11, had opinions that she expressed with a directness that was entirely her mother and a stubbornness that was entirely her father, and had already decided, with the certainty of a child who has been raised to believe that certainty is a reasonable thing to hold, that she was going to be a lawyer when women could be lawyers, and that if they could not be lawyers by the time she was ready, she would help change that. Theresa had looked at Walter when Clara announced this. Walter had looked back at Theresa. "She gets it from both of us," he said. "She does," Theresa agreed with the full smile, the real one. And the ranch was full of evening light and the sound of horses and the wind in the long grass, and the rule was so far in the past it had the quality of something from another life, which in a sense it was, the life before the woman who had arrived and made him remember that protection and love are different things, and that a life built entirely around the first has room for nothing that matters in the way that the second does. He had made a rule. He had never broken it. She arrived. He could not remember why he had made it. And in the not remembering, in the surrender of the rule to the truth of her, Walter Bishop had found the only thing that had ever been worth finding, and he had held it, and he had been held in return, and the wide Wyoming prairie had witnessed it all with the particular patience of land that has seen many things and knows that the things worth seeing are always the same. A person choosing to be open, another person choosing to be known, and the long, good life that grows in the space between.